He didn't even look me in the eye when he said it. My name is Eric, I'm 44 years old, and until that morning I worked at a tech startup where I gave 15 years of my life. I wasn't just an employee. I was there before the coffee machine, before the second floor, before the buzzwords and beanbags. I helped build that place with late nights and quiet sacrifices. And on Christmas Eve, the man I'd helped turn into a CEO sat me down and cut me off like I was a loose wire. He called it a tough decision and said it was strictly performance-related, but he didn't have the spine to say it with emotion. His office was warm, clean, filled with little holiday gifts from clients. Mine had already been cleared out. They must have done it before I even walked in. The moment was strangely quiet. No anger, no shouting, just a final sentence from someone who didn't know how to thank people, only how to discard them. I remember staring at the blinking red light on the office modem as he talked. I'd installed that modem. I'd picked the provider. Back then, I was the guy fixing bugs at 2 a.m., not the guy being blamed for quarterly slowdowns. My hands were shaking, not from rage, but from something deeper, something colder, like a rug had been pulled out from under the last 15 Decembers. I didn't ask questions. I didn't beg, but inside me, something fractured. Not because I needed that job, but because I thought I meant more. I thought 15 Christmases meant something. I walked out without a word. No goodbye, no keep in touch. Just that hollow sound of my footsteps echoing down the hall I'd helped wire, paint, and fill. And that night, while families toasted and laughter echoed through the city, I sat in silence, trying to figure out what part of me had just been erased. People underestimate how much routine can anchor you until it's gone. I woke up the next morning at 6:45 a.m., like I always did, made the same coffee, put on the same shirt, sat at the kitchen table staring at the same mug I'd brought to work for years. But there was nowhere to go. The silence was deafening, not peaceful, hollow, the kind that wraps around your chest and makes every breath feel like a question. My phone didn't buzz, no Slack messages, no meeting reminders, just the ticking of a cheap wall clock I never used to hear. It wasn't about money. I had savings, investments, fallback plans, but the routine, which the way my life used to click into place, one predictable step after another, was gone. And with it, a strange sense of safety. I kept thinking about the hallway, the sound my shoes made on the tile, the way the front desk girl used to nod at me every morning at 8:02. I missed the code, the grind, even the irritating stand-up meetings. That job had become my rhythm, not my identity, but the frame that held everything in place. And suddenly that frame was snapped in two by a man who didn't even ask how I was doing. I didn't tell my family right away. I didn't want to see that flicker in their eyes. Pity, concern, or worse, advice. I needed space to process the shift, to sit with the weight of what had been taken. By the second day, I'd stopped opening my laptop, not because I didn't want to work, but because my hands didn't know where to go without a login. It was just a job, but it was my peace, my pattern. And now I had to sit with the noise that rushed in when it disappeared. It came in at 11:04 a.m. on December 24th. A simple subject line. Transition announcement. 2 lines. That was all I got. After 15 years, 2 sentences sent to the entire company. Eric will be leaving the team to pursue new opportunities. We thank him for his contributions. No context, no closure, just a polite lie wrapped in corporate language. And a signature that wasn't even from my manager. It was from HR. I stared at the screen for a long time. I wasn't angry, not yet, just emptied. The kind of emptiness that comes when you realize people are rewriting your story in real time, and they don't even care if you read it. The worst part? I saw the message hit Slack like a ripple. One by one, people started reacting with those little emoji faces. Thumbs up, clapping hands, a sad face from Jenna in marketing, and then silence. Nobody called, nobody messaged. Not even Tom, the guy I'd mentored through his first coding disaster. People knew better. Or maybe they were just afraid of being next. There was one response, though. Quiet, private. A DM from Luis, the intern we'd hired 2 years ago. I don't know what happened, but I learned a lot from you. Just wanted to say that. It hit harder than I expected. I hovered over the message for minutes, fingers twitching over the keyboard. Do I respond? Do I explain? Or do I let the silence speak for itself? I screenshotted the farewell email, not out of bitterness, but as a way to remind myself that not every departure deserves a stage. Some exits are quiet because the people inside them are still processing the volume. I didn't reply to Luis that day. I just let his words sit there, a single thread of truth in an inbox filled with fiction, and I started wondering how many others had been erased like this, quickly, efficiently, without dignity. They all thought he ran the place. He acted like he did, strutting through the halls with that startup swagger, talking about burn rates and investor calls like he'd built it brick by brick. But he didn't know the deed was in my name. 7 years ago, I made a quiet investment. A small real estate group was buying commercial properties, and one of the buildings they acquired was the one housing our startup. I bought in as a silent partner. No one knew, not my colleagues, not even my closest friends at work. It was just a long-term play. Diversify the portfolio. Let the rent checks come in. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I wasn't expecting power. I just wanted stability. But after that email, after those 2 lines, something shifted. I started looking at the building differently. The cracks in the walls, the worn-out carpet I'd always offered to help replace, the drafty windows on the 2nd floor. They weren't his problems. They were mine. I'd paid for those floors. I owned them in every sense. And yet he barked at people like he owned their hours, slammed doors, gave speeches about being lean while sipping overpriced cold brew from a leather-wrapped thermos. He never once asked who paid the lease. It never occurred to him that the man he fired was the same man who signed off on maintenance budgets every quarter. The distance between his ego and my ownership was vast and silent. I could have told him, walked into his office that day and said, "You pay me twice, once for code, once for rent." But I didn't, because the power wasn't in the reveal. It was in knowing that for all his noise, he never looked around long enough to notice who was holding the floor beneath his feet. And sometimes, the people with the quietest desks write the checks that keep the lights on. There's a kind of power in restraint that most people never learn to use. A week after being fired, I sat at my kitchen table, the same place I'd been mourning that quiet void, and logged into the property management portal. I clicked on Suite 3B, the unit our startup occupied, and pulled up the lease. It was due for renewal in 30 days. I stared at the contract for a long time. I wasn't angry anymore, just clear. He hadn't just let me go. He had dismissed me, erased me. But he still sat in that office every day, walking the halls like they were his to command. So I doubled the rent. I didn't add a note, I didn't explain the increase, I didn't threaten, justify, or hint at who was behind it. Just updated the terms and let the system do the rest. Technically, it was legal. Market rate had shifted. The location had appreciated. If he wanted to contest it, he could, but he wouldn't. He didn't know who he was dealing with. That's the part that sat deepest in me. He didn't know. He thought he'd ended my story, but he was still living in the prologue. The new lease offer was sent. I watched as the read receipt popped up an hour later. I imagined the confusion, the scramble, the emergency meetings with finance, the indignation of someone who never had to consider that they were disposable too. But I didn't gloat. I didn't text anyone. I just closed the laptop and took a long breath, the kind that fills your lungs all the way to your spine. It wasn't about revenge. It was about remembering who I was before he tried to shrink me, before he tried to write me out. And when you've been underestimated long enough, even silence starts to feel like thunder. 2 weeks into January, I got a call from the property manager. He sounded nervous, said the tenant from Suite 3B wanted to negotiate the new lease, claimed the hike was unreasonable, unexpected, damaging to a growing company. I told him to enforce the terms as stated. No negotiation. I wasn't being cruel. I was being precise. From what I heard through back channels, the CEO, my former boss, was livid. He thought the property owner was some faceless investor group. He vented to his inner circle that corporate greed was suffocating innovation. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so revealing. He started cutting costs, cancelled the catered lunches, downsized their cloud storage plan. Employees noticed. Whispers spread. People asked what changed. He never had an answer that made sense. He held emergency meetings with the board, started looking for new office space, blamed the economy, blamed everyone but himself. The truth, that the man he fired now held the lease over his head, never even crossed his mind. And that's what fascinated me most, his inability to imagine that someone like me, calm, quiet, consistent, could hold any real power. In his world, strength wore designer suits and gave keynote speeches. It didn't ride the subway home and work in silence. There's a special kind of justice in letting someone fight a ghost. Every time he tried to bargain, he was shouting into a system that mirrored his own arrogance back at him. Meanwhile, I went on with my life. Same coffee, same mornings, but with a peace he'd never understand. The peace of knowing I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard, because sometimes the loudest answer is no reply at all. Just a line in a contract, enforced by a man he never bothered to see. In startups, visibility is currency. People want their names on walls, their titles in bold, their faces in investor decks. I never cared for any of that. I liked building quietly, writing clean code, solving hard problems, making things run smoother. I wasn't invisible, just uninterested in the spotlight, and that made it easy for him to believe I was replaceable. But what he didn't see was that I had been laying bricks in more ways than one. I was there when we upgraded from folding tables to real desks, when we outgrew the co-working space and moved into the building, my building. I helped choose the floor plan. I watched them install the server racks, reviewed the security wiring, even recommended the HVAC company. Every detail passed through me, and still I stayed in the background, not because I lacked ambition, but because I measured value differently. I didn't need my name on the glass door to feel proud. I needed alignment, purpose, respect, the things that can't be printed on business cards. That's what made the firing so jarring. It wasn't just a job lost, it was a sudden erasure of everything I'd quietly poured into that place. He didn't fire me because I failed. He fired me because I didn't fit into the vision he had for a louder, shinier version of the company. But now, with the rent doubling and no deal on the table, he was starting to feel the weight of his decisions. I kept thinking about all the little things he ignored. The way I always knew when the air filters needed changing, how I handled the Wi-Fi outages before anyone noticed, how I stayed late to clean up after all hands meetings without being asked. He never noticed those things, but the building did. The foundation remembered, and while his name sat on pitch decks and press releases, mine was tucked into something far more permanent, the structure that held his whole image up. That to me was more than enough. The temptation was there. I won't lie about that. I could have walked into the office, flashed the lease documents, and watched his face collapse. I could have announced myself as the landlord during one of his frantic meetings, asked him if he enjoyed the new rent, smiled as he pieced it all together. But I didn't. Not because I'm noble, because I'm tired. Revenge burns fast and leaves ash. What I wanted, what I needed, was something quieter. A sense that what happened to me had meaning, that the dismissal, the silence, the two-line email wasn't the end of my story, but the turn. So I chose silence. I never revealed myself, not to the company, not to him, not even to the friends who later asked, "Whatever happened after you left?" And that decision, to keep it all tucked inside, brought me a strange kind of peace. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just stillness, like closing a book you've read too many times and finally placing it back on the shelf. He doesn't know who raised the rent. He doesn't know who rejected his counteroffer. He probably thinks it's some greedy developer on the other side of town. Let him think that. My story isn't about proving him wrong. It's about remembering that I never needed his permission to matter. I go on walks now, past the building sometimes. I glance up, see the lights still on late at night. I wonder if he still holds those loud, motivational meetings, if he ever stops to think about what he missed, who he misjudged, what kind of person he lost. He never will, but I know, and that's enough. Because this story, it's not his, it's mine, and I chose how it ends. The lease was renewed, reluctantly. He had no other choice. Commercial space in the city had tightened, and relocating on short notice would have cost more than staying. So he stayed, but not without sacrifices. They cut square footage, let go of staff, downsized the break room. What used to be a sleek, glass-walled hub now looked cramped, cold, and mismatched. Word got around that morale was dipping, that the CEO, once all swagger and slogans, was quieter in meetings, more abrupt in tone. I didn't need to hear it directly. The city talks. People share things without realizing who they're talking to. One afternoon, months later, I walked by the building, just passing through. The windows on the third floor were covered with cheap blinds now. The holiday lights I used to string up, gone. The front door had a new keypad I hadn't approved. They must have installed it without knowing who owned the wiring behind the wall. I caught a glimpse of him through the glass, pacing during a call. Still dressed sharp, still talking fast, but something in his movement had changed. He looked smaller, contained, like a man who finally realized the walls were closing in and couldn't figure out why. He never saw me. I kept walking, past the corner coffee shop where we used to grab lattes before morning stand-ups. It was quieter now. No line, no chatter about sprints or funding rounds. He still works there, still signs the memos, still believes he's steering the ship, but he pays more now. Not just in rent, in tension, in staff turnover, in subtle losses, and he stays less. Fewer nights burning the midnight oil, more remote calls, more distance. Somehow, without ever confronting him, I became the variable that shifted his world, quietly, permanently. And while he wrestles with that invisible weight, I walk lighter than ever. There's a moment, months after everything settles, when the noise inside finally dims. That's when I realized I never had to raise my voice. The justice I found didn't come from confrontation or exposure. It came from presence, from being the one thing he couldn't name, control, or erase. I still walk past the building sometimes, not out of spite, out of memory. I glance up, and I remember who I was, not when I was fired, but when I was still showing up every day, thinking effort would protect me. Back then I thought silence meant defeat. Now I know better. Silence can be strategy. Silence can be survival. And sometimes, silence is the loudest answer you'll ever give. He probably thinks he won. That he cleared a spot on the payroll. That he made a hard call for the company. That whatever fallout happened after was just bad timing, tough luck, the market shifting. Let him believe that. Because the truth is, I didn't just lose a job. I shed a skin. I outgrew a place that never really saw me. And in doing so, I left something behind. Not a nameplate, not a farewell party, not a LinkedIn post. I left a shift in gravity. One man got louder. One man got quieter. And the building? The building knew. And now when I think about everything, of the rent increase, the panic meetings, the missed signs, I don't feel triumphant. I feel free, because I didn't burn anything down. I just made sure the lights stayed on long enough for them to see who really kept the power running. And sometimes that's all the closure you need.